The field was ready, the hay was cut and drying, and at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in July 1985, there was one truck in the yard instead of 4. That was the moment the harvest plan started to fall apart. It didn't happen all at once. It rarely does on a farm. It happened the way most operational crises happen, one missing piece at a time, each one small enough to explain away until suddenly they couldn't be explained at all. The farm sat on about 340 acres in the mid-continent, the kind of land that produces good grass hay in a wet spring and punishes you for it in a dry July. That year, the spring had been wet. The first cutting was heavy, maybe 15 to 18% above average yield by the farmer's estimate. That was the good news. The rest of it was complicated. By 1985, the American farm crisis wasn't a forecast anymore. It was the floor. Commodity prices had been grinding down for years. Land that had been collateralized at inflated 1970s valuations was now underwater. Credit was tightening. Input costs hadn't dropped proportionally. And the rural labor market, the seasonal workforce that farms like this one depended on, was starting to shift in ways that weren't obvious until they were catastrophic. A light manufacturing plant had opened 22 miles east the previous fall. It wasn't a big operation, maybe 200 jobs at first, but those jobs paid a predictable hourly wage, came with consistent hours, and didn't disappear after hay season ended. By spring of 1985, several of the men who had hired on seasonally for the past 3 or 4 years had taken permanent positions there. They were still available, or so they said, for the summer cutting. But available is not the same as reliable. The round baler the farm had acquired in 1982 was a significant piece of equipment. It produced large cylindrical bales, roughly 5 feet in diameter and close to 1,500 pounds each. For a farm trying to maximize output from a heavy cutting, the round baler made sense on paper. It moved fast. It could process a windrow in a fraction of the time a square baler could. But the math behind that speed included a set of hidden labor costs that didn't show up in the sales literature. To run the round baling operation efficiently, you needed people. You needed a tractor operator on the Baler. You needed someone coordinating the bale wagon or the spear tractor that moved the finished bales off the field before the next pass came through. You needed people who could handle the equipment, troubleshoot jams, and keep the logistics moving. The round bales themselves couldn't be moved by hand, not at 1,500 pounds. Every part of the operation required mechanization, and every piece of that mechanization required an operator. Scale works when labor is stable. In 1985, labor was not stable. The first man had quit in late June, not with any drama, just a phone call saying he'd picked up full-time hours at the plant and couldn't commit to the summer. The second left a week later. By the first week of July, when the hay was down and drying in long windrows across the east and south fields, the farmer was looking at a crew of 2 instead of 5. One of those 2 was his son, who was 17. He checked the weather forecast on the evening of July 9th. What he saw was not a disaster, not yet, but it was a problem. A low-pressure system was moving in from the northwest. The models were putting rain somewhere in the 72 to 96-hour window. That was enough time to finish the harvest with a full crew running the round baler at normal pace. It was not enough time with 2 people and equipment that required 5. He did the math at the kitchen table with a notepad and a calculator. With the round baler at their current labor capacity, they could process maybe 40% of the cut hay before the rain arrived. The rest would sit in the field and get wet. Wet hay loses nutrition fast. First cutting grass hay that gets rained on before baling can drop in protein content significantly, sometimes from 12 or 13% down to 8 or 9. For dairy or horse operations that buy on quality, that's a price reduction. For anyone buying by the ton for bulk winter feed, wet damaged hay trades at a discount. The financial exposure wasn't catastrophic in isolation, but stacked on top of everything else that year. It was the kind of loss that could tip an already tight operation into a harder place. He thought about calling the remaining former crew members and offering more per hour. He ran those numbers too. To retain enough labor to run the round baler operation properly, 3 operators minimum, he'd need to increase the day rate by a margin that ate most of the expected margin on the hay itself. The math didn't work. The labor market had moved, and the farm's pricing structure hadn't moved with it. The crew didn't show. The hay couldn't wait. The old square baler had been sitting in the back of the equipment shed since 1982, when the round baler arrived. It wasn't broken. It just hadn't been needed. It produced small, rectangular bales, roughly 40 to 50 pounds each, depending on how the density was set and how dry the hay was. It was slower than the round baler by a wide margin. A good day with the square baler, running 1 tractor and 1 or 2 people stacking and hauling, might produce 800 to 1,000 bales from a decent-sized field. The round baler, with proper crew, could clear a comparable field faster and in fewer total pieces. But the square baler had one structural advantage that the round baler didn't. It could run with 2 people. One driving the tractor, one on the wagon, stacking bales as the baler ejected them. That was it. The operation didn't require a spear tractor, didn't require a bale mover, didn't require a 2nd or 3rd driver with specialized equipment experience. A 17-year-old could stack bales on a wagon. The farmer could drive the tractor and keep the baler running. He pulled the tarp off the square baler on the morning of July 10th. The machine hadn't seized or rusted. He greased the fittings, checked the knotter mechanism, ran some twine through the needles, and pulled it out of the shed with the tractor. The first pass through the field went slow. The baler needed adjustment. The tension was off. Bales were coming out loose on one end. He stopped, walked around to the knotter, made the adjustment manually. The next pass was cleaner. They worked from early morning until dark that first day. The farmer drove. His son rode the wagon. Every time the wagon filled, they stopped, pulled to the edge of the field, and stacked the bales by hand into a row that could be picked up later with a flatbed. 40-pound bales stacked 8 high, dozens of times across the afternoon. By mid-afternoon, the farmer's son wasn't talking much. By evening, neither of them was. The output for the first day was around 740 bales. That covered one field partially and left the larger south field untouched. With the round baler and a full crew, the same day might have cleared both fields completely. But the round baler was still sitting where it always sat, idle and requiring people it didn't have. The round baler stood still. The square baler kept moving. On the second day, a neighbor came by to check in. He was running a similar-sized operation 3 miles down the road, had kept his round baling crew intact, mostly because he'd promised them a bonus at season's end, a calculation that would cost him later. He looked at the rows of square bales along the field edge and didn't say much, but the pause said enough. Square baling in 1985 read as a step backward. The industry had been pushing large round bales as the efficient, modern approach. Using a square baler looked like retreat. The farmer didn't explain his reasoning at length. There wasn't time for it. By July 11th, the weather window was narrowing. The forecast had shifted. The rain was now tracking closer to the 60-hour mark rather than 96. A front was accelerating. The south field, the larger of the two, still had most of its hay on the ground. They started before sunrise on the 12th. Bigger equipment reduces time, but increases dependency. That was becoming visible now in a way that hadn't been visible during planning season. The south field took the entire day and most of the evening. By the time they pulled the baler off the field at 8:40 that night, they had secured approximately 65% of the total cut hay. The remaining 35% was still in windrows on the far east section, a low-lying area they hadn't been able to reach in time. The first drops hit around 10 p.m., not a hard rain. A steady, soaking rain that continued through the night and into the following morning. The hay in the east section absorbed it. By the time the rain stopped and the sun came back out, that portion of the crop had been sitting wet for nearly 14 hours. It wasn't destroyed, it could still be baled once it dried. But the quality had dropped. Whatever that section brought at market, it would be at a discount. The farmer called around to buyers on the morning of July 14th. What he found was not what he had expected going into the season. The market for large round bales in the region was moving on bulk contracts, silage operations, commercial cattle feedlots, large dairies. Those buyers expected consistent supply and consistent quality and had their own handling equipment. They weren't interested in calling individual farmers and arranging pickup on short notice, and because several farms in the county had taken rain damage on their cuttings, there was a sudden surplus of lower-grade round bales competing for the same buyers. Price was soft, but the calls for square bales were coming from a different direction entirely. Horseboarding operations, small hobby farms, people with 2 or 3 cattle who couldn't use a 1,500-pound round bale before it weathered or spoiled. These buyers didn't have a bale spear or a tractor with the hydraulic capacity to handle round bales. They needed square bales they could move by hand, store in a regular stall, and use in manageable quantities. And they were willing to pay by the bale at a retail-adjacent price, rather than by the ton at a commodity rate. Efficiency assumes structure. The square bale market didn't require the same infrastructure. The farmer loaded his flatbed truck with square bales and made his first delivery on July 15th, a horseboarding facility that needed 200 bales and paid cash on pickup. The second delivery went to a small cattle operation about 12 miles away. The third was a woman who kept 4 horses on a hobby property and bought hay every 6 weeks. She'd been having trouble finding square bales locally because most of the large producers in the area had converted to round baling. She bought 80 bales and asked if she could be put on a regular list for the next cutting. The cash flow from these transactions was faster and more direct than a bulk commodity contract. No 30-day invoice, no waiting on a feed co-op's payment schedule. Payment came at delivery or within a few days. It didn't make the math whole. The rain-damaged east section still needed to be rebaled once it dried, and that hay would sell at a discount wherever it went. The overall revenue for the cutting was below what a full round bale harvest with a full crew and stable pricing would have produced. That's the version of events that needs to be stated plainly. This was not a turnaround. It was damage control. But the comparison to the neighbor was instructive. The neighbor had kept his round baling crew running. He'd made his bonus promise. But his east fields, larger than the farmer's east section, had also taken the rain, and his crew, the morning after the storm, had shown up late and disorganized. 2 of the men had picked up hours at the plant during the rain delay and weren't available to come back on short notice. The neighbor lost closer to 45% of his cutting to rain damage and was sitting on a large volume of lower-grade round bales in a market that was already soft. His bulk buyer had renegotiated the price downward, citing supply and quality. The neighbor had the faster equipment. He had the larger crew, at least nominally. But his labor structure was fragile in a way that only became visible when it broke. Scale increases dependency. The farmer had built a dependency he couldn't sustain when the labor market moved. The square baler ran through 2 more cuttings that season. The farmer didn't rebuild his round baling crew, not because he was making a philosophical decision about simplicity, but because the wages required to compete with the plant weren't supportable on hay margins at 1985 prices. The round baler sat through the second and third cuttings. It wasn't a permanent choice. It was an operational adjustment to a labor market that had changed. Physical exhaustion was the price of that adjustment. By the end of the second cutting, both the farmer and his son were carrying the kind of fatigue that doesn't clear overnight. Lifting bales by hand, loading wagons, stacking in the barn, it was slower and harder on the body than coordinating equipment operators. That reality didn't disappear just because the square baler could run with 2 people. 2 people doing the work of 5 is not efficiency. It's substitution, and substitution has a physical cost. At the dinner table in late August, there wasn't much conversation. The numbers for the season were done. They were survivable. Feed inventory was covered through winter. The direct sale customer list had grown to 11 buyers who wanted square bales consistently. Cash flow was more stable than the previous year, not because conditions improved, but because the customer base had changed structure. The rain had taken a portion of the crop. The crew had taken a portion of the operational plan. What remained was a farm that had made it through the season under conditions it hadn't designed for. When structure cracks, flexibility matters. That's not a philosophical observation. It's an operational one. The square baler wasn't better than the round baler in any absolute sense. In ideal conditions, stable labor, consistent pricing, reliable bulk buyers, the round baler produced superior throughput. But ideal conditions had left the region along with cheap credit and predictable commodity prices. What remained in 1985 was a labor market in motion, a weather window that didn't accommodate hesitation, and equipment that either required infrastructure that wasn't there or didn't. The round baler required infrastructure. The square baler didn't. That's the whole of it. Labor is part of machinery. That's the thing that farm equipment catalogs don't put in the spec sheet. When you spec out a round baling operation, you're spec'ing out the tractor horsepower and the bale diameter and the output rate. What you're not accounting for, at least not visibly, is the human system that makes the machine move. When that human system destabilizes, when the plant down the road offers a predictable paycheck and benefits, and your seasonal work can't compete, the machine stops regardless of what it says on the spec sheet. The square baler kept moving because the threshold for running it was low enough that 2 people could meet it. That's not a romantic claim. It's a mechanical fact with operational consequences. The east section hay came off a week later, dry enough to bale, and sold at a reduced price to a cattle operation that wasn't particular about protein content for backgrounding steers. The check cleared. It was less than expected. It was still a check. By the end of the season, the farmer had a clearer picture of what his operation actually was versus what he had assumed it to be. He had assumed a labor supply that had evaporated. He had assumed a bulk market that had softened. He had built operational scale around those assumptions, and when the assumptions failed, the scale became a liability. What he had left was a smaller, slower operation with a more stable customer base and a piece of equipment that didn't require a crew to run. Whether that translated into long-term viability depended on factors still unresolved: commodity prices, land payment schedules, input costs going forward. None of that was answered by one hay season. The crew walked out. The hay couldn't wait. The round baler stood still. The old square baler kept moving. That's not a story about nostalgia or going backward. It's a story about what happens when the labor and market conditions that justify a system disappear, and you're left deciding whether to wait for those conditions to return, or to work with what's actually in front of you. In a crisis, flexibility is a form of strength, not because it produces better outcomes, but because it produces any outcome when the alternative produces none. If stories about real operational decisions, labor economics, and how farms actually survived the 1980s matter to you, don't forget to subscribe.